The day is Tuesday, October 3rd, 1347. You're heading in for your regular shift as a longshoreman when a multitude of boats sail into your Sicilian docks. But as you look closer, things are not as routine as you might have thought. Long story short, I'd suggest turning around. Looking closer, it is seen how an obsidian blanket clings to their fingertips and encloses their limbs in darkness. Buboes harden on their necks, creating rocks on their skin. The Black Death was a worldwide pandemic that infected about 30 to 60% of the world's population. A few days have passed since the boat sighting. The dock has cleared and the patients have been dealt with. You're cleared for work the next day, but have been feeling extremely cold recently. You report to work and start loading the ships when you see stains on the floor. Ignoring them, you finish your shift and head home. Over the next couple of days, you notice a purplish color covering the tips of your limbs. Thinking not much of it, you move on, but it slowly progresses darker and darker till it reaches a deep black. This is the inevitable spread of bubonic plague.
The bubonic plague is said to have begun around 1331 in the south of China, spread by infected fleas that typically rats would host. The disease quickly spread to ancient Persia, Egypt, Syria, and India. The reach of the plague expanded towards Eastern Europe, places like London, Paris, and Bordeaux. They were heavily impacted, with Paris's population dropping by an entire half. In Italy, Florence's population was rampaged from 120,000 inhabitants in 1338 to 50,000 in 1351. Best estimates entail around 25 million people died in Europe from 1347 to 1352. Studies speculate that approximately 20 million civilians had fatally been infected in Asia. Whether the rats came into direct contact with the victim or the rats infected hygienic areas that deposited the fleas, the rats eventually infected humans. Once infected, the flea disease became zoonotic, contaminating both people and animals. It was characterized by painful lymph nodes and black-covered limbs. Patients would experience extreme fever and chills with a loss of strength. Many did not comprehend how the illness would spread, since rats typically fly under the radar. Threatening symptoms left many without answers, leaving room for many questionable nostrums. From drinking ground emeralds to your own urine, the desperation of patients was crystal clear as the entire world was thrown off its axis with this baffling new plague.
If that didn't seem to cure them, victims may also drink grinded, roasted shells of newly laid eggs with marigold flowers and treacle in warm beer every morning and night. Medicine became much more scientifically based, whereas before, they relied heavily on religious palm or star readings to help patients. When sickness drew around before, many fell back on mythological treatments based on religion, instead of how today we look to science and chemicals. The bubonic plague brought along a frontier in history and a whole new world of medicine to be discovered. This forced individuals to conquer a world they knew nothing about and to navigate a system they hadn't known existed. As you juggle the mortifying new discovery, you begin to ask around, asking people if they knew what sickness came over on the ships, if you should be threatened. As you ponder, you question the papacy. Turning towards the church is the only way you've been taught to find answers. However, there are none to be found. This is only an example of the situation civilians were thrown into when the plague began infecting.
In medieval Europe, the people relied solely on the church in a crisis, asking for guidance or answers. The people held faith in the church and felt confident in their guidance. These beliefs diminished with the deaths of the bubonic plague brought. The reason being that everyone had assumed this was a punishment from God, and if the church suffered as everyone else did, triggered a rude awakening as the people saw the human side of the church. Realizing the church could not save them from the raging outbreak of the Black Death, the same church was slowly but surely falling lower and lower in its hierarchical bureaucracy, long before the impacts of the plague brought it to its knees. In an attempt to bring themselves higher in the hierarchy, they favored the wealthy over the rest of the public. The people's lack of knowledge of how the bubonic plague started caused them to believe it was a punishment from God for their sins, greed, blasphemy, heresy, etc. They thought the only way to stop the plague was to earn God's forgiveness, to purge themselves of evil. But they did not stop at themselves. They wanted to purify their communities as well. During the bubonic plague, Jews were less liable to contracting the plague as compared to neighboring Christians. Modernly, it is believed that this was possible due to a Jewish hygienial ritual. The Christians believed that the Jews were poisoning their wells. This resulted in the burning of the Jews. Anti-Semitism greatly intensified throughout Europe as Jews were blamed for the spread of the Black Death. A wave of violent pogroms ensued, and the entire Jewish communities were killed by mobs or burned at the stake en masse. The Roman Catholic Church lost status as people turned to mysticism or other movements for salvation from the catastrophe.
A new idea was proposed, a new way of life, and to govern themselves instead of the church. This made room for different religions to be practiced openly. It made them question their ways of life and how they'd previously been morally raising their families according to the church. The overall religious aspect of the plague liberated people and made them less dependent on their faith. People felt less pressured to pray and worship daily and heavily, having worldly responsibilities take the hat over religion. This was a new world of faith to conquer and morals to be questioned. Throughout the bubonic plague, there was sudden and extreme inflation since it was not only difficult but dangerous to trade goods, much less produce them.
The plague had a substantial impact on the relationship between the landowners and the peasants they employed. As the number of deaths became worse, finding laborers to produce goods and offer service was a job in itself. Peasants began to demand higher wages. However, European rulers did not fold.
Instead, an English law in 1349 tried to force workers to accept the same wages they received in 1346. A similar law, the Statute of Laborers, was issued in 1351. The statute said that every healthy, unemployed person under 60 years old must work for anyone who wanted to hire him. Workers who violated the statute were fined and harshly punished. As more workers rebelled, the worse the punishments became. Workers who demanded higher wages could be sent to prison, and if caught on bad behavior, would be branded with the letter F, rumored to stand for fugitive, on their foreheads.
After the plague, the large population of servants kept wages from rising beforehand. Lords began to realize they had less control over workers and began to change what they produced. Many workers were needed to grow and harvest the grain. So some lords began to raise sheep instead, which required significantly fewer employees, causing peasants to begin to enjoy a higher standard of living and greater freedom.
Although the worker population decreased because of the plague, the amount of land and tools did not. Because of the remaining workers had more tools and land to work, they became more productive, producing more goods and services. When workers are more productive, employers are willing to pay higher wages.
Some lords avoided violating the statute by making in-kind payments, paying workers with food or other goods rather than wages. In places like Florence, the ruling factions attempted to make action against the plague by setting up a board of health and establishing quarantine rules. However good the idea, it certainly was not cost-sensitive.
Most towns were struggling with the fact that their working population that had been the backbone of their economic infrastructure was frankly diminished. The economic strain on civic entities wouldn't have been so bad if it weren't for the fact that the tax base the cities and nations depended on for funds was suddenly cut in half when the majority of taxpayers passed away.
As fewer and fewer laborers offered services, the in-service workers became much more valuable. This allowed for much more compensation and allowed for the laborers to grow in economic status at a rapid rate.
This made for the previously known peasants to rise in society and acquire riches they would have never been able to before. Society was changing, one way or another, and not even the top of society could resist the idea any longer. Economics, religion, health. All were impacted by the spread of the bubonic plague. As you heal, you realize how much faith you've lost in the church. In this time period, families raised their children in the image of the church. Their morals, work ethic, values, personalities, health and faith were both declining hand in hand. The New World brought a frontier in history through drastic change in economics, a new system for medicine, and doors opening for religion.